When it comes to learning to read, the two main approaches that dominate the school system in English-speaking countries are balanced literacy and structured literacy, also referred to as the science of reading approach by many people these days. For years and years, the balanced literacy approach has totally dominated reading instruction. During the 90s and the early 2000s, teachers were heavily trained in this type of reading instruction. However, things are starting to change quickly. Many schools are shifting towards the science of reading approach. Still, that doesn't mean that there aren't many advocates of the balanced literacy approach. So what exactly is going on? Why are they shifting? Who is right? What are the differences between balanced literacy and structured literacy? What system delivers better results? What does scientific research have to say about this? These are the questions we'll respond to in this video. This way you can make up your own mind. We will also share with you some resources for further research, should you be interested in digging into this topic even further. The balanced literacy approach. Why does it have that strange name? Balanced literacy. It feels like we are trying to actually balance something out here. Well, that's exactly the case. There are actually two things the balanced approach tries to balance out: the whole word, whole language approach to teaching reading and the phonics approach. I know, we've just introduced two new terms. Well, if you didn't know, phonics and the whole word, whole language approach are radically different methods for teaching reading, and these systems have been fighting with each other for decades. There's even a term for this: reading words. Reading words go way back. Until the late 1920s, phonics was the method used for teaching reading, period. However, a new anti-phonics movement had started to emerge a few years back, and it was gaining popularity really fast. So much so that by the 1930s, phonics, meaning explicit teaching of the code, had been abandoned in most classrooms. The whole word approach replaced phonics. In a nutshell, the whole word method involves memorizing lists, a list of words, relying on certain cues to figure words out. There's no phonics instruction, just rote memory. It is also called the look-say approach. However, results in reading instruction were really poor. It was clear that something was wrong with this model for teaching reading. Many people, such as Rudolf Lesch in the iconic book Why Johnny Can't Read, written in 1955, and its sequel Why Johnny Still Can't Read, written in 1981, or Jean Chol in the book Learning to Read: The Great Debate, 1967, started to advocate moving back to the phonics model. So in the 70s, something changed again. The pendulum did not fully move towards phonics though. Instead, the look-say approach evolved and a new movement started. Welcome to the whole language approach. This movement rejected explicit and systematic phonics instruction again. In their opinion, phonics was boring and unnecessary, and it killed the love for reading. Their approach to teaching reading rely on children's, according to them, innate capacity to learn to read, develop a love for reading, surround children by books. The whole language approach incorporated real children's stories instead of readers. Unfamiliar words were not sounded out, but identified through guessing based on context. Despite its differences from the look-say approach, the whole language approach also involved memorizing sight words and guessing, and very limited phonics instruction. The whole language approach gained rapid popularity in the US, despite a lack of supporting research for its effectiveness. In 1983, reading researchers David Scher and Anthony Jorm introduced the self-teaching hypothesis, emphasizing the importance of independent word decoding in reading. Skilled readers' extensive vocabularies made rote memorization or context-based guessing simply not possible. The necessity of decoding unknown words using letter-sound relationships and blending phonemes was exposed. This puts Cher and Jorm in direct contrast to the whole language methodology. Besides, reading scores were still static and poor. This led to major inquiries into how teaching reading was carried out. For instance, the 1998 report Preventing Reading Difficulties in Young Children, which is normally referred to as the Snow Report. One of the main recommendations of this report was to stress out the importance of phonics. Another major report was the meta-analysis from the National Reading Panel in the year 2000. This report again concluded that phonics and phonemic awareness were key elements for reading success. Balanced literacy emerged as a truce between phonics and the whole language approach, as well as a response to the limitations of the whole language approach. Balanced literacy incorporated strategies from phonics and strategies from the whole word-whole language approach. What does this even mean? How can you reconcile two methods to teaching reading that are so radically different? It is extremely tricky. Balanced literacy involves phonics instruction to some degree. This can be in the form of alphabet word maps, songs, lessons and activities around letters and sounds, etc. It is also quite common to have the letter of the week, especially in preschool settings. However, in balanced literacy, there is not a clear guidance on how to teach phonics. Is it explicit instruction or is it implicit instruction? How structured and systematic is it? How much phonics is actually taught? Are we just talking about a little bit of phonics here and there? Word memorization in balanced literacy. Sight word lists tend to be a pivotal strategy in balanced literacy. Asking children to rely on clues and cues to read unfamiliar words rather than decoding is encouraged in balanced literacy. For instance, by the context, by looking at the picture, or simply by text predictability. Balanced literacy uses leveled readers as opposed to phonetically decodable books with beginner readers. Other typical practices in balanced literacy are teacher read-alouds and shared reading, independent reading, grouping children based on their reading level. Unfortunately, the balanced literacy approach leaves too much room for open interpretation. This apparent flexibility might sound attractive, but it leaves important things in the air. Besides, some of the strategies it heavily relies on can be detrimental. For instance, encouraging children to guess rather than to sound out words, or being okay with children skipping words or saying a different word altogether, provided the meaning of the word is the same. Also, in a way, it shifts the responsibility from the teacher onto the student.
This marries well with the belief that children have an innate ability to learn to read. Remember, this was a whole language belief which has been debunked by science.
Understanding how wrong this belief is has enormous and serious implications on the way we teach reading. The science of reading. You have probably heard the term the science of reading thrown at you multiple times lately.
So much so that you could be wondering, is it a fad?
Is it an ideology or a political agenda? Is it a curriculum? Or is it just a fancy term for phonics? None of that. If you go to the Reading League's website, they define the science of reading as a vast interdisciplinary body of scientifically based research about reading and issues related to reading and writing. In other words, researchers from multiple fields, including psychology, education, linguistics, neuroscience, and more disciplines, are trying to find answers to best practices in reading instruction based on science, rather than relying on ideology or philosophies as it was commonplace in the past. With this information, practitioners, including educators, tutors, parents, can select and implement practices that will be the most effective for the most students. So what are the main conclusions that practitioners should take into consideration? We'll briefly summarize the most important ones in this video, but if you want to learn more about this topic, we strongly suggest you also check out the resources we'll list at the end of the video. For your convenience, links to these resources can be found on the video description as well. To understand how a student develops into a skillful reader, the science of reading looks toward two frameworks that are fully aligned with science. Framework number 1, the simple view of reading. The simple view of reading has been empirically validated by over 150 scientific studies. It shows us that reading comprehension is not the sum, but the product of two components: word recognition and language comprehension. By the way, the term sight word recognition has nothing to do with remembering whole words. It is a term widely used these days to express something like automatic decoding, when readers apply their knowledge of the code immediately and without any apparent attention. The formula is word recognition by language comprehension equals reading comprehension. If any of these two components is weak or missing, reading comprehension will be impaired. The key word here being product instead of sum. Let's illustrate this with an example. What would happen if we assigned a score 1 or 0 to these components involved in skillful reading and multiplied? Word recognition 0 by language comprehension 0 equals 0. Word recognition 1 by language comprehension 0 equals 0. Word recognition 0 by language comprehension 1 equals 0. Only when both components are positive, you get a positive result. Word recognition 1 by language comprehension 1 equals 1. No amount of skill in one component can compensate for the other. Framework number 2, the Scarborough's reading rope. This rope, created by Scarborough in 2001, is a visual metaphor for the development of skills over time, represented by the strands of the rope that lead to skilled reading. This rope allows us to visually understand the complexity involved in the process of learning to read. All of the different strands of the rope are interconnected, but are also independent from each other. Scarborough's reading rope is made up of lower and upper strands. The lower strands include phonological awareness, decoding, sight word recognition of familiar words. The upper strands include background knowledge, vocabulary, language structures, verbal reasoning, literacy knowledge. When all of these component parts intertwine, the result is skilled, accurate, fluent reading with a strong comprehension. Why is the simple view of reading so important? The simple view of reading helps us understand how people read by looking at two main things: recognizing words and understanding language. By figuring out where someone fits on this reading scale, we understand why reading might be hard for them and what we should do to help them. Some examples of instructional practices aligned with the science of reading when it comes to word recognition are phonemic awareness and letter instruction, explicit and systematic instruction in how to decode, read, and encode spell words, connected text reading to build reading accuracy, automaticity, fluency, and comprehension. Examples of instructional practices not supported by scientific evidence. Emphasis on larger units of speech, syllables, rhyme, onset rhyme, rather than individual phonemes. Implicit and incidental instruction in word reading. Visual memorization of whole words. Guessing words from context. Using picture cues. Skipping words. Emphasis on speed or words per minute over accuracy when reading texts. Some examples of instructional practices aligned with the science of reading when it comes to language comprehension are: read aloud from a variety of complex texts to build knowledge and vocabulary. Robust conversations to develop students' academic language. Explicit instruction in grammatical structures and academic vocabulary within the context of other reading activities. Examples of instructional practices not supported by scientific evidence. Read aloud from level text that students will be reading so that text is not sufficiently complex. A lack of explicit instruction of morphology, memorization of isolated words and definitions out of context, and a lack of strategic and intentional instruction. Implicit instruction of grammatical structures. The science of reading includes learners with linguistic differences such as multilingual learners and English learners. These students also benefit from the practices derived from the science of reading. There's way more to the science of reading than this, but hopefully you've understood that this is not a phonics program, but a set of guidelines based on science that anyone involved in the process of teaching reading can refer to select and implement practices about reading that will be the most effective for the most students.
Would you like to understand more about the science of reading? These are some awesome resources. The Reading League's website.
Books. Reading in the Brain.
Written by a leading neuroscientist, this book is excellent for those who want to understand what happens in the brain when we learn to read, why we're even able to read, how the brain of an illiterate person is different from a reading brain, what exactly is going on in the dyslexic brain, and much more. The chapter about dyslexia is my favorite one.
So much so that I created a video summarizing the main insights, findings, and ideas from this chapter. If interested, you can watch it here. The book contains a wealth of interesting information, although some of it may be challenging for non-experts in neuroscience.
However, there is also plenty of actionable information, such as recognizing early red flags that may indicate dyslexia.
Language at the speed of sight. How we read, why so many can't, and what can be done about it, by Mark Seidenberg. Fascinating and thought-provoking book.
This book confirms the effectiveness of phonics in teaching reading with scientific evidence.
Once more, in this book you learned about the brain, neurology, and the history of reading, but also what's been proven to work in reading instruction and what hasn't. Some parts can be hard to read, but it's mostly written in an engaging and fascinating way.
The ultimate goal of this book is to provoke changes in teaching methods for reading.
If you are an educator, you might see this book as a platform from which to advocate for change. Shifting the Balance by John Perkins and Carrie Yates. 6 ways to bring the science of reading into the balanced literacy classroom. This book is easy to read and very practical. You'll find lots of activities and suggestions for the classroom setting. You want to read this one especially if you're transitioning from the balanced literacy approach into a structured literacy and you want to make sure you are in line with the science of reading principles. How to Plan Differentiated Reading Instruction by Sharon Walpole and Michael McKenna. An excellent resource that will make you rethink your configuration of small groups. Rather than grouping children by their reading level, this book emphasizes the importance of grouping children based on their individual needs. What specific skill are they lacking? Is it phonemic awareness? Is it reading comprehension? By grouping children this way, you can truly work on their lacks and see effective skill development. Speech to Print by Louisa Cook Modes. While this book can be dense and hard to read at times, we have still included it in the list because it is a great reference book. Uncovering the Logic of English by Demi Seed. Do you believe there's no logic in the English spelling system? Do you believe it's just formed by exceptions on top of exceptions? If so, this book will make you think twice and probably change your mind. While definitely not as straightforward as most phonics-based languages, the English spelling system has some logic behind it after all. This book reveals some tools that will help you unlock its intricacies and teach them to your students. Equipped for Reading Success by David Kilpatrick, a comprehensive step-by-step program for developing phonemic awareness and fluent word recognition. This book summarizes the latest research about how we learn to read and has a strong focus on the development of phonemic awareness. If you work with struggling readers that lack phonemic awareness, this book can be an excellent resource for you. Links to all of these resources and other additional resources can be found on the video description. We will also leave you a link to an article on our blog that contains all of this information so you can have a written reference to come back to in the future. Hope you enjoyed this video and find it useful. If so, please like, share and comment. Just like this one, have a good browse around the Learning Reading Hub channel and don't forget to subscribe.